Hello, friends. I'm Kathy Fay, Executive Director of the Boston Early Music Festival, or BEMF, and on behalf of the Board of Directors, staff, artistic directorial team, and countless artists, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this very special first event of our monumental and historic all-virtual Boston Early Music Festival and Exhibition. The theme of our 21st biennial festival, Music of Solace and Joy, was carefully considered and established many months ago when none of us had an understanding of what would be in store for us in June of 2021. Given the clear path we're on to a much healthier and brighter future, I think we can all agree that there's so much to celebrate. I hope you will join me and so many friends and fans around the globe, starting today, Sunday, June 6th, when our festival officially begins, and throughout the week, as we offer a host of performances and free events by over 100 artists from around the world, including 2 archival opera performances, 14 newly recorded concert performances, a virtual presentation of our world-famous exhibition, and so much more. If you have not yet purchased tickets to our festival, you may do so at any time by visiting bemf.org. And you can order tickets between now and early July. While our festival week extends from Sunday, June 6th through Sunday, June 13th, and our fringe concerts follow 1 week later from Monday, June 14th through Sunday, June 20th, in fact, we have arranged for all of our festival events to be available for viewing as many times as you wish at your convenience, 24/7, all the way through Sunday, July 11th, 2021. As a complement to the cornucopia of delights we have in store for you this week, we invite you to follow along with a copy of our beautiful June 2021 commemorative Boston Early Music Festival program book. The BEMF program book contains a wealth of information about all festival concerts and operas, as well as artist biographical sketches, the directory of exhibitors, details about our fringe concerts, advertisements from industry colleagues, colorful photos, and so much more. And all of this for just $25, including postage, mailed to your home, or $5 for the digital version, which can be accessed on the BEMF website. But now on to the matter at hand. An astonishing highlight of our virtual festival week, thanks to our forethought 5 years ago and our decision to make an archival recording of our production, is a complete video presentation of our June 2017 North American premiere of André Compra's operatic masterpiece, Le Carnaval de Venise. This performance begins at 3 p.m. today, Eastern Standard Time, and as I noted, can be viewed entirely until July 11th. Leading our 2017 production were BEMF's Grammy-winning musical directors Paul Odette and Stephen Stubbs, internationally acclaimed stage director Gilbert Blin. Our fully staged spectacle featured an outstanding cast of 19 singers, the 27-member Boston Early Music Festival Orchestra led by Robert Neely, a troupe of 10 Baroque dancers led by our dance director, Melinda Sullivan, with choreography by Caroline Copeland, lavish costumes designed by Anna Watkins, breathtaking sets designed by Gilbert, and magnificent lighting by Christopher Ostrom. Produced in partnership with the Center for Baroque Music in Versailles, 4 performances took place in the dazzling Cutler Majestic Theater at Emerson College in downtown Boston. Joining us this afternoon for a conversation about the evolution of our groundbreaking production, I am so honored to welcome Paul Odette and Stephen Stubbs, Gilbert Blin, Robert Neely, Caroline Copeland, and Rebecca Harris Warwick, Professor of Music at Cornell University, who will serve as moderator. I regret to inform you that due to scheduling difficulties, we will not be joined by Melinda Sullivan, our dance director, or Benoit Dretwicki, the artistic director of the Center for Baroque Music in Versailles, or Barbara Nestola, musicologist and director of research at the Center for Baroque Music in Versailles. Our thanks to these 3 outstanding colleagues for their essential role in our North American premiere production. Before I turn our virtual stage over to Rebecca, I hope you will join me again this evening at 7 p.m. following the opera for a live post-concert Q&A and champagne toast. You'll have a chance to meet and greet members of the Compra Opera Company, ask questions, and celebrate this joyful opening night of our 21st Boston Early Music Festival and Exhibition. My thanks to all, and Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. I wanted to thank you for your work in making this festival possible, which is a remarkable effort given the circumstances that we're all living in right now. Now, before I open the floor to the creative team, I just wanted to say a few words about the background of this opera and the remarkable work that it is that you are going to see it in a couple of hours. It has an unusual position in French operatic history. It's really one of a kind. Especially when you compare it to the traditional repertoire that some of you know of the Paris Opera, because you've been to other operas here at Banff by Lully. You've seen Thésée, or some of you have anyhow, seen Thésée and Psyché. And I find this opera, Le Carnaval de Venise, particularly fascinating because it marks a real turning point in one way and a unique position in others. The Paris Opera was founded in 1669 and taken over by Lully in 1672. And for the next 15 years, nobody could compose or perform opera in France except Lully at the Paris Opera. He had a monopoly on writing opera. So after his death in 1687, the company opened up to other composers, and Compra was one of them. Now, those of you that do remember some of the Lully operas will know that this one is strikingly different. So Lully's operas were mythological, or that were based on legends, but they were set in some distant, faraway place. Whereas this one is set in contemporary times. That was a new phenomenon in the Paris Opera. It happened a little bit before this opera, but not very much. And a contemporary setting automatically implies comedy, or a certain element of comedy, whereas the tragedies had to be set in distant times. So that's a topic that we'll be revisiting in the course of this discussion. So there are comic elements in this, even though the plot is basically serious. Now, in terms of structure, this opera, like Lully's operas, does have a prologue, but this one is really quite different from any prologue that Lully ever wrote. And Lully's operas were in 5 acts. This one has 3, but it also has 2 little appendages at the end that are quite interesting and quite peculiar, and we'll talk about them more later as well. So as you will see, that the comic elements that work their way in here have certain elements in common with the Comédie dell'arte, which was being performed in Paris at this time. It was a big part of Parisian theatrical life. Those are the differences. So what does this opera have in common with Lully? Well, a very large cast, not so much of the principals, but of other colorful characters who have cameo roles at different times, both singers and dancers. Now, in this case, because the opera is set in Venice, you get all kinds of colorful characters from Venice that are occupying these roles. The other thing that really marked French opera as different from Italian opera in this period is the role of dance. Dance was interwoven throughout the whole opera. It wasn't put in a separate little part, done separately from the singing, but integrated with it, both in terms of the frequency in which the rhythm in which it goes back and forth, and in terms of the musical connections between the dance pieces and the vocal pieces. And you'll be hearing much more about the musical styles from the various musicians involved here shortly. So why Venice for a setting for an opera in 1699 in Paris? Well, there are many reasons, but one of them is that the French were absolutely fascinated with Venice at this time. And we can see this by entire books that were published explaining Venice to the Parisians, written in French, reports in the newspapers written about travelers, reports that when they went to Venice. All of these things are that we mined for learning about how the French saw Venice in this era. And this was not confined to opera, by the way. Lots of plays at the period were set in Venice. They even got started before the opera did. Now, when you're setting a French person setting an opera or a play in Venice, there's certain things that are obligatory that have to show up. You have to have gondoliers. You have to have people in carnival season that are wearing extravagant costumes and who are masked. You have to have gamblers. You have to have exotic dancing. All of this was part of the carnival season, and it fascinated people around Europe. Now, the protagonist in this opera is named Leandre, and he's a French tourist. So that was one of the plots that happened a lot too, is a French tourist would go to Venice, fall in love with a beautiful Venetian woman, and complications ensue, as you will soon see. So as you probably know, Venetian Carnival season is still going on. It's happening even in a minuscule form this past year. So this happened at the same time that French composers were getting very interested in Italian music. And Campra was one of them. He himself was, his father was Italian, and he grew up in southern France where he had more contact with Italian music. But he was just one of many French composers who were starting to get intrigued. So you all presumably know François Couperin, who wrote a collection of music called Les Goûts Réunis, the United Taste, in which he tried to unite French and Italian music and pieces together. So this was part of a larger aesthetic movement. So what you will hear in this opera is something that is sung primarily in French, but it has moments in Italian, sung in Italian at the same time. It has a mixture of musical styles, predominantly French, but Italian as well. And on the stage, you will see a lot of characters that look like something out of the Commedia dell'arte, which just to remind you, then there you would see characters like Harlequin and Mezzotin, the stock lovers characters. The lovers in this opera even have the kinds of names that you would have in a Commedia dell'arte play. So I just want to say one last word to end here about the structure of this opera. So you have 3 acts of the opera, and then all of a sudden the 2 protagonists, after all the plot has been resolved, the lovers have gotten together, they decide to go to the opera. Now the opera was one of the sites that Venice was famous for. It had many opera houses, not just one like in Paris. So they go to an opera and they sit down and they watch the opera. And so what we see as the audience is a little Italian opera that Campra wrote for the occasion called Orpheus in the Underworld. And then, because we're imagining this is the last night of Carnival, then the opera house turns into a ballroom, as it did in Venice, in the actual Venice at this time, and a ball is performed. Now, the French thought that Italian dancing was extremely boring. So there was no way that they were going to put on stage an Italian style ball. So what do we see? A French court ball on the stage of an imaginary opera house in Venice. It's really quite amusing. But once again, we get the mixture of styles, because partway through this ball, the comic characters come on and they conclude it in a more Venetian manner. So as you will see, this real mashup of different styles in this opera. And at this point, I would like to turn this over to Gilbert and ask him about, given all of this mixture, Gilbert, how did you conceive of this opera? What was your vision for how you would put it on stage, and what do you want the audience members to look for?
Well, it is indeed a fantastic piece and truly unique. And all of people who are interested in Venice and as some picture of the Carnival, see how much this could be a fantastic ground to build a spectacle, which was really the mean of this type of opera at the end of the 17th century, where indeed dance was more predominant and as different type of language, where costume were bringing some new ideas that's never been seen on the stage of the Paris Opera before. I think for me, the fact that I was lucky enough to see a performance when I was very young of this opera at the Festival of Aix-en-Provence in 1975 or 6, I don't remember, I was a teenager, has been starting a process for me. And then after that, when the Carnival was reinstalled in Venice in the early 1980s, I went there myself and took part in the Carnival, and a wonderful experience of the city in the time of Carnival. So even the big amount of tourists we see today, nowadays, let's say in Venice, are integrated in the Carnival, and then you don't mind so much about this kind of thing. It's really it was a truly fantastic experience. So when the team, we were looking for a piece which could be really integrating all our knowledge of 17th century French and Italian opera, I came to propose this title, and quickly we decided to do it together, because I was convinced this was a fantastic piece, which is not the opinion of everybody before we did the show. Some people thought it was not a good opera and that we should not do it. But in fact, the show was revealing how much the piece is sophisticated, right to the point, and as a form of fantasy, which is truly touching for us today as audience and as artists. So I went to see a lot of this type of literature of the time that you were speaking about, Becky. And more specifically, I really read every play of Renard and of the Comédie Italienne at the time, where we had some texts which has been brought to us. And then I noticed that there were a lot of structure and things which were common with the libretto Renard, the dramaturge, the dramatist made for Campra, for Le Carnaval de Venise. And that has been, beside my personal souvenir, feeding the structure of the opera and our performance style. So everything had a meaning in the narrative, but also giving this kind of background that was so important in the project, the initial project in 1699, but also in our project. We wanted people to really share this trip to Venice, this travel, this projection to this amazing place with Campra and Renard.
Oh, thank you. That's a great start. And now let me turn to Steve and Paul, to the music directors for this, and ask you, coming off of conducting many Lully operas, and also coming off of your experience of directing Italian operas too, what interested you in this particular score and how to bring it to life?
I would start with saying that ever since Paul and I did the Rossi Orfeo at Banff in what was it, 1997? Is that right? We began to think about our own future as opera directors in terms of seeing the progress from there forward, how opera evolved. And so we went through Cavalli's Ercole Amante, which was the next opera done in Paris, an Italian opera done in Paris, and finally got to Lully, as you mentioned before. And so in many ways, this particular experience was a sort of culmination of a journey for us as artists through this terrain of the late 17th century. And it brought together so many special things. All of the things that you've mentioned already are certainly true, that the evolution included a proliferation of dance, a proliferation of the sort of divertissement moment. And we haven't used that word before, but I'll just mention that in all of the tragedies of Lully, they were formal 5-act tragedies, as you said. And the typical thing was that at the end of each act, there would be the last portion, 5 or 10 minutes of the act, given over to the divertissement, where it's all singing, all dancing. It's sort of a party atmosphere. It's set in various places. That's not different here. It's just that it's proliferated into, the divertissement has sort of grown everywhere, right? So entering into this project, for me, I mean, I was aware of two special things that were sort of a given. One was this proliferation of the dance element and the sort of lighthearted feeling of the divertissement. And also the fact, as you mentioned, that it was set in contemporary times. It was not mythological characters in some mythological Arcadia, but the element of exoticism here is that it's going to Venice, a place which you could actually visit. It's exotic. It's not where you live, but it's someplace you could know. It's someplace that is a known feature. All of that was a known quantity to me. What surprised me and what sort of took my musical interest was that an element of Lully's own evolution within his own works was that as his tragedies went on year after year, as you mentioned, for 15 years, he dominated everything. His evolution included the inclusion of ever more full orchestra accompaniment to the voice, so that arias were not just accompanied by the continuo and recitatives also, but whole portions would be accompanied by the full orchestra. And particularly, I think this is a marker of a kind of seriousness and depth in characters. If that's the way Lully used it, but it's also the way Campra uses it, to sort of give us an insight into the inner workings of a particular character by giving them a large scale accompanied recitative. And each character gets to introduce themselves that way. Of our four leaders, in Act 1, Leonore comes on and has a big scene like that. And then in Act 2, Rodolphe comes on and has a big scene like that. Isabelle has the scene in Act 3. Leandre, as the French guy, just doesn't get a scene like that. But anyway, what surprised me was that this sort of marker of seriousness and depth was so prominent in a piece that I expected to be entirely lighthearted.
I think there's also a wonderful aspect of marketing, which is part of the genius of Campra and Regnard behind this, that instead of presenting another tragedy, as the Italian Commedia troupe had just been disbanded in 1697, they were still very popular with the French public. And so all of the theater companies were snapping up the members of this Italian Commedia troupe because there was a thirst for comedy and color and fun. And so I think Campra and Regnard drew on this by incorporating comedy based on a lot of the Commedia characters into this piece. The other thing that Campra seems to have been very conscious of was this mixing of Italian and French elements. And he speaks very clearly about that in the preface to, I think, his first book of cantatas in 1706, where he writes, "I wanted to combine the delicacy, the elegance of the French style with the vivacity of the Italian." And throughout this piece, it is a kind of kaleidoscopic back and forth between French Lullian style tragedy, really Renaissance Italian based dances, which then turn into arias and choruses, and many Italian arias, which are based on Italian dances. So we get a Saltarello, we get a Villanella, we get a Tarantella, and then the entire Italian opera at the end. And I think that the genius of this is the mixing of the serious with the comic, the French tragic with the Italian lighthearted, with all of the color and variety of the dance component.
Yes, well, speaking of the dance, let me ask Caroline, could you talk about the challenges for you as a choreographer of making exactly that combination of the French and the Italian? We know a lot about French dancing in this period, not so much about Italian. So how did you handle this?
Well, some of it is obvious when you come towards the end of the opera and they're asking for Commedia dell'arte characters. Some of it is maybe not so straightforward, but I'm thinking about the gondolier scene in Act 3, which in my mind, because of the Italian Moresca, which were these danced and mocked battles, I was trying to create something that had that sense of a mock battle mixed with the novelty dances that were so popular in the theaters in Europe, by making sounds with the oars. And there's certain physicality of the dancers, larger gestures, less contained. Whereas in the prologue, there was more a use of the danse noble style and the French style of dancing, more contained in terms of the gestures of the arms and the legs. But as soon as we enter the culture of Venice seen through French eyes, then it's all about different kinds of local color and character, and we get more into the demi-character, and there's so much comedy and lightheartedness, and even in our gambling den, licentiousness. And we really leave sort of the French noble style in the prologue. I'll leave it at that. And then after that, we get into something that's more lighthearted, more comic, a lot more high jumping, beating, turning, things that we think of as part of the Italian grotesque style later on in the 18th century, which Becky knows all about. So I was drawing upon those kinds of ideas for at least, Act 1 and onwards.
So Robert, if you don't mind following up on this whole question of the mixture of styles, could you talk a little bit about what the difference is between an opera orchestra for a French opera as opposed to an opera orchestra for an Italian opera, and how this fits into the picture?
Absolutely. One of the, I think one of the big glories of the French opera, along with the dance troupe and the chorus and the amazing soloists, was the fact that Lully had created this incredible institution of the French Baroque orchestra and really managed it with an iron fist. There are all these stories about him breaking violins and people played an ornament at the wrong place. With the result that you had this incredibly disciplined ensemble. That one of the aspects of it in France is that it's an ensemble that has 5 parts rather than 4. So it's extremely sumptuous as well. There are 3 viola parts. We're playing all this at the pitch at the time, which was 392. So it's very low, very, very resonant. So the effect of all of that is for the French portions, as Steve was talking about, these amazing opening arias effectively for each act. We're really able to provide this really fantastic tapestry for the voice right there. And then the wonderful thing is that we then also get to dance as well. So we're very much part of the party. The dance tunes that we get to play are so memorable. A lot of them became such hits at the time. And there are a couple of tunes that actually come again and again through the opera, kind of as a, the pop tune that you're all going to remember when you leave the theater. So for us, it's really a pleasure not only to explore the deep French style with this, but also to explore this fantastic light Italian style. I mean, since Campra, I think coming from the South, coming from Provence, there's something so very tuneful about all his music and very light often. So that's one aspect of it. I think for those who haven't seen our Banff productions before, you'll also be struck by the fact that the physicality of the orchestra pit, we actually, because of the theater, we've the nature of the pit in the Cutler Majestic, we've actually reproduced the 18th century practice of having a long music stand. So you'll see that the orchestra is actually, it looks like we're at a really fabulous dinner party. So there's incredible connection with the stage. You'll see that there really isn't a conductor to speak of. Paul and Steve work very, very, very closely with the singers in preparation for all of this. We work together with Caroline and the dancers to create, to find the right tempos, the right affects for all these dances. And I work on making the orchestra into a really coherent unit. So I'm leading the orchestra from the middle of the crowd. Paul and Steve are on the end with the great Continuo team, but we're all in incredibly intimate contact with whatever's going on stage. So it's very different from a modern situation where the orchestra is invisible. You don't get to see the people in the pit, but we're all part of the same party.
Paul and Steve, do you want to weigh in and continue what Robert was saying there? I'm sure it seems like a segue to the two of you.
I think there is one interesting instrumentation element that we had to grapple with, which was that the typical French orchestra of this time did not have cellos because they didn't exist in France yet. But they had an instrument called the basse de violon, which was tuned a tone below the cello, so it had a low B flat, and that low B flat turns up in several places in this opera. They did not use a 16-foot pitch instrument, a double bass, in France yet. That comes in a few years later. But we faced a dilemma because some of the fast passages in the bass turned out to be very awkward in this B flat tuning of the basse de violon and much more natural to the cello. So our cello department said, we think this may have been an early example of writing for cellos with a double bass, even though it's not documented. And when we looked at the Italian Orfeo in the underworld, the opera within the opera, that certainly wanted to have a double bass instrument in it. So we opted for the combination of cellos and double bass rather than the typical French 17th century basse de violon.
And Paul, bringing up the opera within an opera, the Italian opera that was visited by our protagonists, the Orpheus in the Underworld, that posed us another interesting question, which was what is the nature of this piece? And I mean, one thing you can say about it is that Campra is making a definite effort to write Italianate music. And so, but that doesn't really tell you anything about the character of the piece, right? If it's Italian, not French, but it doesn't tell you, is it tragic? Is it comic? Is it something in between? But when we started doing it without actually making a presumption of what the material was about, we started doing it and we realized, wait a minute, there are things that are happening way too fast for operatic time, you know? So Orpheus comes pleading with Pluto to let him into the underworld. And within 1 minute, Pluto says, okay, that's fine, come on in. And you just think, wait a minute, that's not how it happens in opera. And that's certainly not how it happens in a serious opera. We began to see that it was actually a send-up of the whole style of Italian opera, and particularly of Italian performance style. And we kind of let our singers loose on the idea that they were going to go whole hog on the idea of sending up this overblown style. It's kind of as if you would have a cast of characters who would normally do a straight play and say, well, we're going to do this part like a telenovela, and you're just going to go over the top with everything. And giving them that license led to really incredibly funny moments that we didn't pre-program. We just sort of let it happen and then saw what fantastic comic potential was there.
And there are two aspects of that I think were really important. First of all, if this opera in an opera had been tragic, I don't think it would have functioned very effectively at that point in the opera. It's a moment in the opera where there has to be some comic relief. Otherwise, I think it wouldn't have worked. And the fact that Becky had kindly given us some draft copies of chapters from her book, which has since been published, in which she discovered that the final chorus of this Orpheus in the Underworld appeared in a very clearly comic context in another work of Campra, that became quite clear. But the other thing that led me to believe that this was really a parody of some of the excesses that Italian opera singers and players took at the time is that this was just a time in France when they were talking about the tastelessness of Italian opera performances. And of course, a short time later, the Italians themselves were making fun of their own operatic excesses, overacting, over-singing, tasteless ornamentation. And I must say, I thought it worked dramatically, extremely effectively in the performance.
Well, that's great. I was always asking myself that question about what exactly the tone was of that, but which makes me want to return to Gilbert, because that's a question that comes out through the entire opera. What is the tone, and how did you decide, and what kind of decisions did you make on that level?
Well, I think in every story you have to give the characters a chance to bring emotions and reactions in the audience. Every character in this production is important for me, as I hope you will, our audience will see when they watch the opera itself. So with Caroline, we really have been looking through everything and detail every person on stage with great care. They all have a story, they all have a reason to be on stage, and we know where they're coming from, where they are going, and why and how they interact together. So in fact, the story by itself was really for us to give life to this text, because the libretto has been printed quite fast. The original libretto we got, and it's kind of scarce. I mean, it's not very detailed. So we also created characters that we knew would be logical in relation with Renard type of play. So for example, we created some servants which are not named, but could have been there because of course at the time, neutrals were not credited in any way. We don't have anyhow the original cast of this opera, unfortunately, although we know for few roles who sing them, but we don't have an official paper telling us this kind of thing. So that was also the point for us to create this energy so we could on stage believe the story and the serious element, which is because any love story can be tragic and funny. I mean, one component is that if it succeeds, it's likely to be more happy and funny than tragic, obviously. And that's the choice of Renier and Campra. So even if they go through some hard times in their moment, and including there is an attempted murder, for example, there is a scene of let's say, bullying, I could call it this way. I mean, it's kind of hard tension between these four characters, as you will see. They all have a reason, we think, and we believe in, to be like that. So these serious characters, the four protagonists, have also some more light-hearted moment, obviously, but they are the serious characters, and they are drawn in this vortex of this carnival, which change their perception. There is misidentity stories, there is misunderstanding, there is lies, etc., etc. And all that is emphasizing the quality of the second reality that carnival, masked balls, theater, opera gives to life. In fact, it's a true life, but under the mask of the carnival.
May I ask you a question about a specific spot? And that is the opening of Act One, when the two women have their confrontation, the two women who are both in love with this French tourist. Each one of them thinks that he loves only her. So on the page, when you first read this looks like a serious rivalry. But then when you read it the second or third time, you start seeing the humor in there that Renier put into the scene of that rivalry. And so there's a place where you had to decide how to have them behave. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, we were all gifted by two fantastic performers, of course, Karina Gauvin as Leonore and Amanda Forsyth as Isabelle. And these singers have been working with us quite a lot, and they have a natural dramatic instinct. So they also very quickly themselves discovered that all these lines, which are sometimes a little conventional at the first look, are full of second agenda and a kind of almost court perfidy type of things. And it's very relevant to the fashion of the time for interactions between people, where you have always to keep a certain formality, but if you are smart enough, you can still make your point through flourish French discussion. And that is typical comedy, French comedy. We find that in Molière, obviously, who was the big inspirer and example for Renier, and Renier acknowledged that himself. Of course, Renier came after Molière passed away, and the play of Renier were performed with the play of Molière at the Comédie Française at the time. So we took this element, and we can see these two ladies interesting us in their story. And that's the point of any opening scene. You don't need to tell everything. You don't need to broadcast one image of the character, but you let them interest you and develop the interest in the audience. And that's what I'm always trying to do with my colleagues when we start the opera, is not to solve everything about the character immediately, but to give us enough interest so we want to see more, and we want to see the full piece and know how it ends.
So Caroline, Gilbert was talking a little bit before about how you and he worked together to give everybody a role and a personality. Could you talk a little bit more about that happens on the dance front? So often people think that dance in an opera is just all about the steps, and that's not what he was talking about at all. So could you explain your work there?
Yes, I think this is why Gilbert asked me to collaborate with him on this particular project, is my great fondness for acting and for character dancing and portraying characters on stage, which this opera, in each act, in each scene, the dancers are portraying different characters with a different carriage of the body, with a different, although similar stepping, executed in a different way, different gestures, sometimes different props. So there's a lot of detail that goes into crafting each kind of character. And I was just looking back at my notes before this, and I realized that Gilbert and I and Paul and Steve, we created about 34 different choreographed opportunities in Compra's ballet. So that's a large amount of choreography. Sometimes I use notated dances as a base. There's only one notation that we know is from this opera, the Forlana at the very end of the opera, composed by Pécor, the choreographer. And a lot of the dances are composed by me. So for those of you who write out there or compose music or poetry, you know things, your work goes through many different edits. So usually I come to the process with an outline. As long as I know the character and the setting and the musical form, then I can usually take it from there. And even though I came with a lot of clear outlines or even fully composed dances, I had to be willing to change ideas on the spot, given perhaps a new element that Gilbert suggests. Or I think Paul and Steve and I said, oh, that Forlana is so catchy, we should play it twice. So I have to compose a dance for everybody, and then out of that I emerge. The Saltarell in Act 3, I think we weren't even sure we were going to do it, and I think Paul pushed us to do it. Okay, so I'm in the studio. It was the very last dance I created for the opera, and it's one of my favorites. I was a little delirious by that point. But again, once you're clear about the characters, who they are, how they're going to stand, how they're going to move, then the steps, of course, are informed by the rhythms of the dance tune. So we have that rhythmic base on the bottom. And the fun part is really matching that with the, the novelty of what happens on top. And the dancers, we had 11 dancers in the cast, 9 professional dancers and 2 young artists who were my former students at Hofstra. So I had wonderful colleagues to support me throughout the process.
Well, that's wonderful. And I gather later in the festival, we're going to get to hear about the Young Artist Program. I think, Gilbert, you are doing a session about that, if I'm remembering. But I'd like to return to a question that came up earlier, and that has to do with the fact that you have all worked together for a long time. And Gilbert, you were talking about knowing the singers and knowing what they could do, and that helped shape the beginning of the opera. But I'd like to ask Robert about that too, because the membership of the orchestra has been quite stable too, has it not? And could you talk about what that means for your working relationship and how you rehearsed?
I think one of the great things about BEMF is just that it really is a community. We have worked together for many years by now, and there's definitely a really strong feeling of a house style, which is fantastic, of a real tradition that we're working in. I think one of the things about historical performance is actually that we're embarked on recreating these traditions as living traditions that we're really living with ourselves. So yeah, it's something that by now I think all of us really feel that we can speak this language fluently and persuasively. So in a situation like in the pit here, where everyone is really quite distanced, it's like, you know, sitting on a bus, you have to sort of peer over your shoulder to catch the violas at the end of the line. But there's a fantastic sense of these connections going on between everyone, that these shared glances, this complicity between everyone, as we're all embarked on this project together.
I remember when we first did an experiment at BEMF in 1995 doing Purcell's King Arthur, and we said, we're going to do this without a conductor. And all of the members of the orchestra at that time said, oh, well, that's impossible. You can't do that. It'll never be together. And by the end of the project, all of them came up to me and said, this was so interesting. We had to listen so much more carefully and watch each other in order to play together. It was a totally new experience. And of course, now they're accustomed to listening and watching rather than watching a person tell them what they're supposed to be doing, how they're supposed to be feeling.
That speaks for me and for the spirit of your work and our work, I dare to say, that in a BEMF production, and Le Carnaval de Venise is a perfect example of that, there is a very strong awareness of what's going on. There is no one on stage or in the pit or backstage who doesn't understand or doesn't know why and how it works. So there is of course, from the start, a true interest for the work of every people involved and obviously respect, but also this is a communication and everything feeds the process. So the awareness that you were describing and the origin of this choice, the artistic choice, so consequential for what BEMF is doing, has definitely effect on everything we do, and I would say even more on stage, because we ask the same discipline on stage, Caroline and Melinda Sullivan, our dance director, to our performers, singers, dancers, or extras, that you ask in the pit. You can't just be passing by in a BEMF production. You need to be really involved if you want to make it right. And that's what this production, I mean, obviously it's recorded, so I dare to say it works in this way.
And I think one of the great virtues of being involved in this project is that we can, as the orchestra and as the Continuo, we can actually watch this extraordinarily detailed stage picture that Gilbert and Caroline have created. And I think one of the great virtues of this virtual festival we have now is that you viewers can actually come back to this opera again and again and actually trace their fascinating developments. All the characters, not just the principals, but everyone on stage has some kind of story going on. And that only unfolds when you see it a couple times. So definitely recommended for repeated viewing.
I'd like to point out one thing that is a definite outgrowth of our feeling of being a company, as we've all been talking about the orchestra, the singers, and so on. And that is that besides the four protagonists, Karina and Amanda and Douglas Williams and Jesse Blumberg, who we know well from many productions, also the people who were the protagonists in our little comic intermezzo of Orpheus in the Underworld are very, very well known to us. In fact, the Orpheus that we cast in that role, we have cast him as Orpheus again and again in serious operas like Monteverdi's Orfeo or Charpentier's La Descente d'Orphée aux Enfers. So we know him as a serious Orfeo, and to see him coming on and sort of making light of not only the style of Italian singers, but really making light of himself. He kind of like lampooning his own serious style was just a delight. And same thing for Tess Wakeham, another star. They were our Acis and Galatea together. We've seen them over and over again as sort of romantic heroes and heroines, and to see them lampooning their own style was just a delight.
Well, it happens for Caroline also. I mean, her first appearance in the show is as Peace in the prologue, and it's all very grand, very noble, very French, I dare to say, I mean, 17th century French. And then at the end, she appears as a commedia dell'arte character, as a burst of folly, as a burst of imagination. And that is really wonderful to see embodied in our choreographer and our first dancer. These two aspects of the opera, it symbolized them in a way all together. And that's why we did that. In fact, I wanted Caroline to have a place which was really truly unique, but also symbolic of the whole artistic project of Campra, Ronyard, and BEMF.
Thank you, Gilbert. And one of my favorite parts is between those two extremes is in the middle and being upside down as a demon and having someone's tongue between my legs.
Oh, and before that, as a dog.
And as a dog, and then a dog.
Yes, as a dog pursuing Actéon in the Masquerade of La Fortune. Yes, a lot of different identities.
I love those references, and I seem to remember that you also planted some other references inside your choices on stage, like advertising the Orfeo and the Underworld right from the beginning of the opera. Somebody's carrying a poster, isn't it? Something like that.
Yes,
and,
well, yes.
There are lovely little touches like that people watching the opera should look for.
Well, in fact, that's an example of the continuity and dramatic and choreographic and musical we put in the show. Who are these people singing in the opera house? Who are these so-called Italian singers? And I thought, well, we need to see them arriving at the beginning of the opera and promoting their own show from the beginning, because we also have, if you want to do Carnaval de Venise giving each role to a different singers, the company is around 170 person, which is obviously already a lot for any company, even for a strong and big company as BEMF. So of course, if you want someone like Aaron Sheehan, for example, who sing Orfeo in the Italian opera at the end, well, we want to hear him also before, but I am not for someone who tried to just change the costume of an actor just because I need two characters. I much prefer to give the actor, in this case, a singer or the dancer, something to build in his energy, especially in this case, because this big moment is obviously at the end of the opera. So instead of having him waiting in his room in the theater, put him on stage straight from the beginning, helping him to build the character. And that's an example of the continuity we put in the show.
I have a question. I don't know who to address it to, so whoever would like to answer, but that has to do with rehearsing. You have a lot of crowd scenes in this opera, perhaps more than any of the other French operas that you've done, I mean, which are noteworthy for their crowd scenes. But this is astonishing. And I'm just wondering, you were saying, Gilbert, that everybody backstage, or maybe it was Robert was saying, everybody has this feeling of community while you're working. But how does that play out in practice when you're rehearsing all of that? It's really complicated.
Upstairs, downstairs. Upstairs in the Emmanuel Church, we usually have the dance rehearsals, and downstairs are the staging rehearsals, and the dancers and singers the traffic flows both ways, because the young artists, of course, are studying movement with Melinda and I, and the singers are also involved in many of the dance scenes. So there's multifaceted rehearsals happening. Every corner of Emmanuel Church is being used for some sort of coaching, choreography, rehearsal. And then of course, for the group scenes, that's it's such an exciting part of the process, because finally all the artists get to come together, and because we all like each other genuinely, it's and because Carnaval de Venise is it is like this ongoing party. The group scenes, I have to say, were a lot of fun in this opera just for that reason. It is a lot of people to organize, and Gilbert and I are next to each other, moving around the space, and sometimes separate, giving different directions to different people. But the goal is, to create something cohesive. And somehow we always manage to make it work with diligence and good humor on all parts.
Absolutely, and a good rehearsal is also a rehearsal well prepared. Yes. And I can't emphasize enough the work which has been going into this production prior our first rehearsal. Indeed, the team has multiple communication meetings, summits, and involving, of course, in the way presenting regularly the update to Kathleen Fay, our executive director, who of course organized the whole project besides the whole festival. So trying to shape the things. So when we are in rehearsal, we usually know what we are after. And indeed, because there is communication between all of us rather easily, and a true sense of collegiality, which is of course under the supervision and guidance of Paul and Steve, things are moving on. I mean, the things are moving on. People come in a madhouse, but then at the end of the day, when we put all the pieces together, musical, choreographic, dramatic, costumes, props, everything, it works because we know what we wanted.
And there's still room for discovery. I think that's so important. A score in a library is just going to stay there, and you will only know what's on the paper, but you really don't know what's going to happen until you bring everything to life, until you sing the tune, until you play it, until you dance to it, until you combine all those things into one scene. And then you have certain realizations about the opera in the opera, and different possibilities reveal themselves. And what's so great about this group of people is that we are open to new ideas. We're open to the unexpected. We are open to coming into a studio with one concept, and then somebody just showed us another path, and we're willing to try it and see if that is effective, or if that's within our artistic endeavor.
And it's certainly one of the great satisfactions of this whole production for us to feel that, as Caroline said, that a score on a shelf only tells you what's on the paper, but only in a production like this, where every element of it is taken seriously and done as well as we could, can you see it come alive. And one of the great satisfactions for us, I think, was the fact that our French friends from the Centre de Musique de Versailles, Centre Baroque Musique de Versailles, said they had no idea what a great piece this was until they came and saw our production. So you can't really do better than that.
I think it's also important for the listeners to understand the complexity of the whole rehearsal process, because what Gilbert and Caroline put together with parallel rehearsals with dance and singers, and Steve and I are usually rehearsing with the singers and the continuo before Robert arrives and starts rehearsing with the orchestra. When we rehearse these crowd scenes, the first thing we have to do is have musical rehearsals with the choruses and really get them to understand exactly what we expect to have happen in the music before Gilbert starts moving them around on the stage. And they might be able to sing it standing still like a normal chorus, but if they're running up and down across a bridge going over a canal in Venice singing a complicated chorus, that's another experience entirely. And once the movement is added to the singers, Caroline comes in with the dancers and they get brought into that and discover, oh, it doesn't all fit and we have to make adjustments to this movement and that movement. And with the excitement of all the extra people there, the singers lose track of the rhythm and the orchestra, and it all falls apart. And we have to bring them back up close and standing still and re-rehearse the music. And it's an ongoing process to get to the point which takes my breath away when I watch certain scenes of this, of a stage full of singers singing complicated choruses with no one waving their hands in the pit, but it's all together.
So in practice, in the rehearsals, Robert, are you the one that is responsible for getting the chorus? Are you leading the choral movements too, or is that Paul and Steve with the continuo? I mean, I can see at the beginning, before you get there and the orchestra arrives, you can defer the arrival of the orchestra a little bit during the rehearsal process, but it still seems to me the choruses are always singing with orchestral accompaniment. So you must be a major player in getting them together.
I'm probably the most visible person for them in the pit, so I flail extra hard when there's a chorus going on. So and it's a lot of it where with the chorus, often we'll find key members of the chorus or people who are in a very ideal location on stage to communicate information to the rest of them. So we'll be eyeballing each other. So there's a lot of, as I say, a lot of complicity, even across this enormous stage. That's kind of the amazing magic of this, that we're all really part of this community.
You look like you're about to say something, no?
No, I'm just marveling at our wonderful team here and thinking, it only looks so coordinated on the stage in the end and in the pit because we all actually enjoy making art together.
So how long is your rehearsal period? It's pretty long, isn't it, for an opera these days in this era?
No, it's not. It's not long. No. That's not. We should not go there, Becky, please. No, it's never long enough. And in fact, the most difficult thing is not so much to put the show together, but it's to bring it to an actual theater, where obviously there is a lot of technical things to deal with. In a regular opera house, for a new piece, because we have to consider this piece as a new piece. It's easier to do Tosca in a week than to do a Campra or a Lully opera in a week, because for obvious reason. So it's like a new piece. And sometimes it's good that we don't have necessarily the composer next to us, although all the manuscripts and the autograph are on the easily access of the computer of all the musical players here. And for us, for Caroline and I, we have all our original documents also easily accessible. But it's a new piece, so we need to understand how it can work really on stage. There is no tradition, there is no rules. There is wonderful books and Becky, you are one of our, of course, our Bible, which we can consult and learn from, and in great details explaining certain things. But we don't know everything, and nobody will know everything because it's history. So we can't trace every details of a performance at the time. It's still historically informed, but that needs a lot of time. And there is no doubt in my mind that the experience, the knowledge, the curiosity we bring from other pursuit, artistic pursuit, other opera, other production, other colleagues are feeding also our way to approach our work. Everybody in the team, singers, dancers, instrumentalists, and directors are also working on multiple projects, which enrich considerably the project we do together when we meet in Boston. And I think that's in fact what we don't have of time to share. It's time for partying. And maybe one success of the Carnaval de Venise was because the piece is a party itself. We embrace it also in this way. It was fun to do, as Caroline said, because there is this amazing energy, vitality in the music, and you get elevated by that. You get cheered up. So it's also perfect choice for festival music of solace and joy, because it is a music, Campra, and the libretto of Renier goes, of course, as a support to that, to be more cheer up, to be more happy and smile about the fun, or what could be fun in life.
Well, let me just ask you as a final question, all of you, what are there any more things than what we've talked about already that you would like the audience to really be aware of, to be listened for, or to look for when they watch this production? And I just have to say that, having seen it before, they're in for a treat. I mean, if you weren't there 4 years ago and didn't get to see it the first time, make sure you see it, because it's such a spectacular opera, and do go back several times. I think it's worth that. But what do you want us to listen and look for?
I'd say that from the experience of the original production, there were quite a few people who told us that they had come back a second and third time and saw different things. So I think this is a wonderful situation we have now, where this is going to be available so that people can see it more than once. And really, I recommend, exactly as you do, that you do see and hear it more than once, because there's so much, it's hard to take in at one time.
The show was conceived that that everywhere you look on stage, something is happening, and obviously you can't look at every point at the same time, which in fact is more or less what this movie of Cathy Whitman is doing. The video caption, she chooses what to look at. So there is also a huge work from her side to make her own vision, literally, of the show. We are live performers first. At least I think of myself as that. I'm not a movie director. I am not a video director. I am a stage director, and more specifically for musical theater and opera. And that is a component, the live performance, the energy you feel, the warmth, the little sparkle in the eye of a dancer, the gesture of welcoming a singer after something. These little details, that's also what makes Boston Early Music Festival opera production so special and so relevant. There is no decorum there. There is true people which are giving their best with their body and their heart on stage of a beautiful theater for an audience. We are just fortunate, as Cathy reminded us in her welcoming words, that we have been smart enough to invest in some caption which were only done originally for archive purpose, for us to look back and learn from our good thing, but also sometimes from our mistakes. And in fact, this production is perfect for that, because it's certainly one of my favorites in Banff, and even in my career as a stage director, as an opera director, because there was really a true moment of bliss, and of course the little pride, I dare to say, from all of us, to show that this piece was a good piece. As Steve reminded us, there were some people who didn't believe in that project. And at the end, every member of the orchestra, every singers, every dancers, every technician on stage. So this is a great piece. This is a great show. This opera was not made to be published on a score. It was not the purpose of it. It was meant to be on stage. It's a spectacle, and opera is supposed to be on stage. That's the key word for a good opera, I would say.
And
I think after a year,
I have to admit, I was one of the skeptics because I knew for years how near and dear to Gilbert's heart this particular piece was. And when he proposed that we perform it in 2017, I went out and listened to a recording and I thought, oh dear, that's a very dreary, long piece of music. And then as we started looking at the score and studying it, we started to understand the richness, the color, the variety that is there. So I would just say, in general, people should not judge a work of art based on one performance that they may have heard, because a work which may not come across in one performer's vision may be life-changing in another vision.
and I think after a year of isolation, it's really a great joy to come back to this party.
Hear, hear.
It most certainly is. And I want to thank all of you for all of the wonderful insights that you've given us, future spectators, and a half an hour, I guess, when we start up to watch the opera. So let me just thank every one of you for being here, and thank Kathy again for all she's done to make this possible. And to thank you for coming to the festival, being faithful participants. And I hope some of you, I gather some of you may perhaps are new to the festival, and I hope you will stick around the whole week and enjoy what you can see. So thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, Becky.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I